Beside him, Lyra, a name she had reclaimed from the bitter ashes of betrayal and purified with a mother's love, was humming a tuneless song, her own eyes, a softer, mossy green inherited from Alara, focused on the dancing flames. They were 5 years old. 5 years of stolen peace. 5 years of watching them grow, of seeing Kaylin's features reflected in her son's face, a constant, painful reminder of the man who had tried to destroy her. She ran a hand over her face, the rough calluses on her fingers, a testament to a life of chopping wood, tending her garden, and hunting for their food. She was no longer the soft, trembling girl who had flinched at every raised voice. The wilderness had stripped her of her fragility and replaced it with a core of unyielding strength. But this summons, this single sheet of paper, threatened to unravel it all, the grand mating ball, a spectacle of power, wealth, and desperation. A cattle market for unmated she-wolves, a chance for alphas to expand their influence and secure their bloodlines. Attendance was not optional. The king's decree was law, absolute and unbreakable. To defy it was to invite the wrath of the royal god to be hunted down as a traitor. They would find her small cottage, they would find her children, and the questions that followed would lead back to a truth she had buried under years of silence and survival. Her wolf paced restlessly beneath her skin, a caged beast snarling at the scent of the world beyond their sanctuary. It remembered the sneers, the shoves in the corridors, the whispers that followed her like a miasma of poison. Hybrid. Witch scum. Tainted. The words had been stones thrown at her day after day, chipping away at her spirit until she felt like little more than a collection of bruises. She had been born of a Blackwood wolf and a traveling healer, a woman with an affinity for plants, and a lineage they deemed impure. Her mother had died when she was young, leaving Alara with a legacy of suspicion and the quiet, observant nature that the pack mistook for simple-mindedness. They did not understand her silence. They could not comprehend a mind that preferred to listen, to watch, to feel the hum of the forest, rather than engage in the brutal politics of the pack. To them, her silence was an admission of her own worthlessness, a hollow space where a proper she-wolf's ambition and cunning should be. The ball was to be held in the capital city, a place of overwhelming noise and suffocating crowds. And Kaylin would be there. Of course he would. Alpha Kaylin of the Blackwood Ridge, a rising star among the regional leaders, would never miss an opportunity to display his power, his perfect Luna, Lyra, draped on his arm like a trophy. The thought of seeing them made a cold, hard knot form in her stomach. The thought of them seeing her was even worse. What would they see? Not the scrawny, terrified 19-year-old they had cast out. She was leaner now. Yes, but it was the leanness of a predator, corded with muscle from a life of true hardship. Her hair, once a plain brown, had been bleached in parts by the sun, and her skin was tanned from her hours spent outdoors. But her eyes were the same. The one feature she shared with her mother, a soft green that held the wisdom of the forest. They would know her, and their cruelty, she knew, had not diminished with time. Liam's tower of blocks crashed to the floor, the sudden noise pulling her from her spiraling thoughts. He looked up at her, his silver eyes wide with concern. "Mama, are you sad?" His voice was a small, perfect echo of another's, a voice that had once condemned her. She forced a smile, the expression feeling foreign and stiff on her face. She knelt down, gathering him into her arms, burying her face in his dark hair. He smelled of wood smoke and clean earth, the scent of her life, her purpose. "No, my love, Mama is not sad, just thinking." Lyra toddled over, pressing her small body against Alara's back, a silent offering of comfort. They were her world, her reason. She had built this life for them, a fortress of solitude to protect them from the hatred that had nearly destroyed her, and now she had to leave it. She had to walk back into the fire. But this time, she would not be the one to be consumed. A flicker of something cold and sharp, something she had not allowed herself to feel for 5 long years, sparked in her chest. It was not hope. It was not courage. It was rage, pure and glacial. They had taken everything from her once, her home, her name, her safety. They had tried to take her life. They would not take her children. If she had to go back, if she had to face them, she would not go as a victim, seeking pity. She would go as a ghost from a past they thought they had buried, a silent arbiter of a truth they could not escape. The king's decree was a chain, meant to drag her to the capital. But she would forge that chain into a weapon. They wanted her at their ball, a spectacle of shifter society. Very well, she would give them a spectacle they would never forget. The memory was a phantom limb, an ache that throbbed with a pain as fresh as the day it was inflicted. It came to her, unbidden, in the quiet hours of the night, a cruel tapestry woven from firelight, sneering faces, and the scent of betrayal. It was the night of the Blackwood Ridge mating ball, the first one presided over by the newly ascended Alpha Kalen. The great hall had been suffocatingly hot, filled with the mingled scents of pine from the decorations, roasting meat, and the cloying perfumes of the hopeful she-wolves. Elara had stood near the back, a shadow in a simple grey dress, her silence a stark contrast to the giddy chatter around her. She had no illusions about being chosen. She was the pack's pariah, the hybrid girl, the witch bloodstain on their proud lineage. Her presence was a mere formality, a requirement she fulfilled with quiet resignation. Kalen had been magnificent and terrible that night, a true alpha in his prime. He moved with a predator's grace, his silver eyes sweeping over the crowd, a smirk playing on his lips. He was power incarnate, and every she-wolf in the room craved the heat of his gaze. Elara had only ever wanted to be invisible to him. But then Lyra had found her. Lyra, with her bright, cunning eyes, and a smile that never quite reached them. She had been Elara's only friend, or so Elara had believed. She'd sidled up to her, her arm linking through Elara's, a gesture of false solidarity. "Don't look so grim, Elara," she'd whispered, her voice like honey, laced with venom. "Tonight could be your night." Elara had simply shaken her head, her throat too tight to speak. She knew Lyra's words were a mockery. Later, she saw Lyra whispering in Kalen's ear, her perfectly manicured hand resting on his arm, her expression one of grave, feigned concern. She saw Kalen's gaze flicker towards her, his brow furrowing. The smirk was gone, replaced by a look of cold distaste. A knot of dread had tightened in Elara's stomach. She didn't know what lie Lyra was spinning, but she knew it was for her. The choosing ceremony began. One by one, the unmated males stepped forward, claiming their mates. The air was thick with tension and triumph. Finally, only Kalen and a few of his elite warriors remained. It was the Alpha's turn. The hall fell into a breathless silence. Kalen's silver eyes scanned the remaining she-wolves, his gaze a physical force. He passed over dozens of beautiful, eager faces, and then his eyes locked onto Elara's. For a heart-stopping moment, there was nothing but the connection between them, a silent, charged current. Then his lip curled in a sneer. He raised his voice, and it boomed through the hall, laced with contempt. "There is a taint in this pack," he declared, his gaze still holding her captive, "a weakness we have allowed to fester for too long." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. He started walking towards her, each step deliberate and menacing. The other wolves parted before him, leaving Elara exposed and terribly alone. "The hybrid," he spat, the word an accusation. "The one they call witchblood. She stands among us, silent and barren, her impure blood a threat to the strength of our future." He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell the scent of power rolling off him, a heady mix of storm and forest. He loomed over her, a mountain of judgment. My father was too soft, Kaelin continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. He allowed this thing to remain, out of some misplaced pity for her mother. But I am not my father. I will not tolerate a curse in my pack. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Alara's shock. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, to scream that she was not a curse, that her mother was a healer, not a witch. But the words were frozen in her throat, trapped behind a wall of terror. Her silence was her undoing. He took it as guilt. I have been told, he said, his eyes flicking for a moment to Lyra, who was watching with a look of triumphant pity, that she practices the dark arts, that she whispers curses on our newborns, that her very presence invites blight and sickness. The lies were so monstrous, so utterly baseless, that Alara could only stare at him, her green eyes wide with disbelief. This was Lyra's work. The venomous seeds she had planted had grown into a monstrous tree of falsehood, and Kaelin was its willing gardener. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers biting into her flesh like a steel trap. He dragged her to the center of the hall, throwing her to the floor before the great hearth. She landed hard, the impact jarring her bones. I, Alpha Kaelin of the Blackwood Ridge, reject this female, he boomed, his voice a formal decree of damnation. She's nothing to this pack. She's barren, a worthless vessel, and her tainted blood will never mix with ours. He pointed a commanding finger at the main doors. I exile her. From this moment on, she is packless, an outcast. If she is ever seen on Blackwood lands again, she is to be killed on sight. A roar of approval went up from the pack. They were his wolves, loyal and fierce, and they had absorbed his prejudice as their own. They saw her not as a person, but as a symbol of impurity that needed to be purged. Two of his warriors hauled her to her feet. They dragged her from the hall, past the faces of the wolves she had grown up with, faces now twisted with hatred and disgust. No one spoke for her. No one met her pleading gaze. They were all Kaelin's creatures now. They took her to the edge of the territory, to the cliff overlooking the roaring river. The cold night air bit at her skin, through the thin fabric of her dress. One of the warriors shoved her forward. "Go, witch," he snarled, "and pray the winter takes you quickly." They didn't even watch her go. They turned their backs, their duty done, and walked back towards the warmth and light of the great hall, leaving her alone in the darkness. The pain of Kaelin's rejection was a physical wound, a gaping hole in her chest where her sense of belonging had been. But it was the betrayal that cut deeper. Lyra's smiling face, her false friendship, her carefully crafted lies, that was the poison that would fester for years to come. Alara had stood there on that cliff edge, shivering and broken, the sound of the pack's celebration a distant, mocking echo. She had nothing, no one. She was 19 years old, and her world had ended, or so she had thought. As she stumbled away into the deep woods, a different feeling began to take root in the frozen soil of her despair. It was a tiny, stubborn seed of defiance. He had called her worthless. He had called her barren. He had called her a curse. He had been wrong about all of it. And deep within her, another life, a secret she hadn't even known herself yet, was just beginning to stir. Her survival, in those first few weeks, was a brutal, instinct-driven affair. The wilderness that bordered the Blackwood territory was unforgiving, a place where weaker creatures were swiftly culled. The girl Kaelin had exiled would have died. She was soft, frightened, and knew nothing of the true wild. But the woman who emerged from that crucible of fear and desperation was someone new. Alara's wolf, long suppressed by the pack's scorn and her own trepidation, rose to the surface, clawing its way out of the cage of her humanity. It was a primal, desperate thing, but it knew how to survive. It taught her how to hunt, how to find shelter, how to read the tracks of prey and predator alike. She learned to eat things that would have turned her stomach before, to sleep in hollow logs, with one ear cocked for the slightest sound, to drink from icy streams that numbed her lips. The simple grey dress from the mating ball was torn to shreds within days, and she fashioned crude clothing from the hides of rabbits she managed to catch. She was filthy, she was starving, and she was utterly alone. But she was alive. And with every sunrise she greeted, the seed of defiance within her grew stronger. He had left her for dead. She would live out of pure spite. It was about a month into her exile when the sickness started. A wave of nausea would overwhelm her every morning, and a profound exhaustion settled deep in her bones, a weariness that had nothing to do with her physical struggles. At first she feared it was a disease, a final, cruel trick of fate. But then came the other signs. Her sense of smell, already heightened by her wolf nature, became almost painfully acute, and a strange protective instinct began to hum within her, a low thrumming that was both foreign and deeply familiar. The realization dawned on her slowly, a terrifying and miraculous sunrise in the darkness of her mind. She was pregnant. The irony was so bitter it almost made her laugh. Kalen, the great alpha who had publicly declared her barren and worthless, had planted his own legacy within her. The memory of their coupling was hazy and shameful. It had happened weeks before her exile, during the fever of a full moon. A brief, frantic encounter in the woods that he had clearly forgotten, or had chosen to dismiss as meaningless. For him, it was a moment of primal, thoughtless release. For her, it had been a moment of confusing, overwhelming connection to the alpha she was conditioned to both fear and revere. Now, that single, secret encounter had changed everything. She was not barren. She was carrying the alpha's heir, or heirs, as she would later discover. This knowledge became her armor. Her survival was no longer just about her own defiance. It was about the lives she now carried. She had to be stronger, smarter, more careful. She pushed deeper into the unclaimed lands, traveling for weeks until the scent of the Blackwood pack was a faint, distant memory. She found her sanctuary by chance, a hidden valley, nestled between two towering, impassable mountains. A clear, fresh river cut through it, and the forest was ancient and thick, teeming with game. In the heart of the valley, built into the side of a hill, was an abandoned cottage, old but sturdy, its stone walls covered in moss. It felt like a gift from the goddess, a place where she could finally be safe. Here, she prepared for the birth of her children. She fortified the cottage, learned the properties of the herbs that grew in the valley, and stockpiled food and firewood. The silence of the valley was a balm to her wounded soul. There were no whispers, no sneering looks, only the gentle sounds of the forest. Her silence, once a mark of her otherness, became a source of strength. In the quiet, she could hear her own thoughts, feel her own power. She gave birth alone, on a bed of furs before a roaring fire, her only companions, the silent ancient trees outside her window. The pain was immense, a fire that threatened to consume her, but she met it with a strength she never knew she possessed. First came her son, Liam. His cry, a robust sound that filled the small cottage with life, and as she held him, marveling at his perfection, another wave of pain seized her. To her astonishment, a second child followed, a daughter, Lyra. Holding them both in her arms, her body weak but her heart soaring, Elara knew she had found her purpose. They were perfect, and they were undeniably Kalen's. Liam had his father's dark hair, and, even in the dim light, she could see the unmistakable, luminous silver of his eyes. It was the one trait that had defined the Blackwood Alpha line for generations. Lyra was more like her, with a dusting of brown hair and her own green eyes, but the scent of their blood was the same. The Alpha's scent, powerful and undeniable, clung to both of them. It was a truth she could never speak, a claim she could never make. To do so would be to invite Kaelin's wrath to have her children stolen from her and raised by the man who had discarded their mother, or worse, to have them destroyed as abominations, the offspring of a tainted hybrid. So she raised them in secret, in the loving silence of their hidden valley. She taught them the ways of the forest, the names of the trees, and the stars. She taught them to be kind, to be strong, to be resilient. She never spoke of their father. To them, the world was their valley, and she was their sun, their moon, their everything. The king's decree, lying on her table, was a threat to all of it. It would force her to bring her children, her precious damning evidence, back into the world of the man who had decreed their mother worthless. The fear was a cold serpent coiling in her gut. But as she looked at Liam's silver eyes, so full of trust and love, she knew she couldn't hide forever. Kaelin had built his reign on a foundation of lies. He and his chosen Luna, the treacherous Lyra, had prospered, while Ilara and his true heirs had lived in exile, and the scales of justice were hideously unbalanced. Perhaps it was time to tip them. The mating ball was a summons, yes, but it was also an opportunity, an arena, a stage, and she was no longer the frightened girl who had been cast out. She was a mother, a survivor, and she had a story to tell, a truth to reveal that would shatter their perfect world. The thought was terrifying, but it was also intoxicating. The rage she had suppressed for so long was finally stirring, sharpening its claws. Kaelin had wanted a spectacle. She would give him one. The decision, once made, settled in her soul like a stone, sinking into the deep, still waters of a lake. There was no more turmoil, no more fear-laced hesitation. There was only a cold, clear path forward. For 5 years, she had been defined by her past, a victim of Kaelin's cruelty and Lyra's ambition. Now, she would define her own future, and in doing so, rewrite theirs. Her preparation began, not with choosing a gown, but with honing her mind and body into a weapon. Every morning, she rose before the sun, her children still asleep in their small beds, and went to the river that ran through her valley. She would submerge herself in the icy water, the shock, a baptism, that washed away the last vestiges of the timid girl she had been. She let her wolf run, pushing its senses to their limits, tracking the faintest scents on the wind, hearing the softest footfall in the undergrowth. She was faster, stronger, and more attuned to the world than any pack-raised wolf who grew soft on cooked meals and warm beds. Her senses were a razor's edge, sharpened by necessity. She also tended to her appearance, but with a pragmatist's purpose, not a debutante's vanity. She used river clay to soften her skin and crushed berries to bring a hint of color to her lips, but it was not for attraction. It was camouflage. She needed to look presentable enough to gain entry to the ball, but not so remarkable that she drew undue attention before the right moment. Her goal was to be a ghost, a whisper, until she chose to become a storm. Her silence was her greatest tool. In the pack, it had been a mark of shame. In her exile, it had become her language. Now, it would be her shield and her sword. She practiced maintaining a state of absolute calm, of unreadability. She would not give Kaelin or Lyra the satisfaction of seeing her fear, her anger, or her pain. Her face would be a serene mask, her eyes deep, still pools that revealed nothing and hid everything. Her children were the center of her strategy, the living, breathing heart of her truth. She looked at them with a new, calculating eye. Liam, her little alpha, was a perfect miniature of his father. The silver eyes were the most damning evidence, a genetic seal of the Blackwood, lineage that was impossible to fake and universally recognized. Lyra, her sweet girl, had Ilara's coloring, but carried the same potent alpha scent as her brother, a scent that would be a clarion call to any true wolf senses. The problem was how to get them to the capital, and how to reveal them at the precise moment. She couldn't bring them to the ball herself. Children were not permitted. She needed an ally, someone she could trust implicitly, Her mind turned to the only person who had shown her kindness in her old life, an elderly Omega wolf named Silas. He had been the pack's archivist, a gentle soul who had often slipped her extra food and offered a quiet, sympathetic smile when others jeered. He had been old then. He would be ancient now, likely living in the Omega's retirement community on the outskirts of the capital. It was a risk, a huge one, but it was the only way. She spent days composing a letter, her hand, more accustomed to holding a hunting knife than a pen, cramping with the effort. She wrote of her survival, of her children, and of her plan. She enclosed a lock of Liam's dark hair and a small dried flower from her valley, a silent plea for him to believe her and to help her. She entrusted the letter to a merchant she occasionally traded with, a grizzled human who asked no questions and valued his gold, giving him a pouch of her carefully gathered medicinal herbs worth a small fortune in the city to ensure its delivery. Then she waited. The days leading up to her departure were a strange mix of meticulous planning and aching nostalgia. She looked at her small cottage, the home she had built with her own hands, the sanctuary that had saved her, and a pang of sorrow hit her. This was the only home her children had ever known. She was about to shatter their peaceful existence, to drag them into a world of politics and prejudice. Was it the right thing to do? The question haunted her. But then she would look at Liam's eyes, the silver inheritance that marked him for greatness, a birthright that Kaelin had unknowingly discarded. She thought of her daughter, Lyra, who deserved to know a world beyond a hidden valley. She was not just seeking revenge, she was claiming their future. She had to believe it was the right path. The merchant returned a week later with a small, sealed reply. Silas was alive. The letter was short and cryptic, filled with cautious words, but the message was clear. He would help. He named a place, a time, an arrangement for her to leave the children with him before the ball. A wave of relief so profound it made her knees weak, washed over her. She was not entirely alone in this. Finally, she had to choose what to wear. She had no fine gowns, no jewels. She had only one dress suitable for anything other than wilderness survival, a simple, dark green garment she had sewn herself from traded cloth. It was the color of the deep forest, the color of her eyes. It was unassuming, elegant in its simplicity. She would wear no ornaments, no perfume to mask her scent. She would go as herself, Elara of the wilderness, a woman who needed no artifice. Her scent was that of pine, river water, and clean earth. It was the scent of the wild, a scent that would be alien in the perfumed halls of the royal palace. It would make her stand out more than any silk or satin. On the morning of her departure, she knelt before her children. She explained, in the simplest terms she could, that they were going on a journey, that she had to attend a special gathering, and that they would be staying with a kind old man for a short while. Liam, ever serious, looked at her with his father's eyes. "Will you come back, Mama?" he asked, his small voice tight with worry. "I will always come back for you," she promised, her voice thick with emotion. She hugged them tightly, breathing in their scent, committing it to memory. This was the gamble of her life. She was wagering their peaceful existence against the chance of a secure future, a life free from hiding. She was walking into the heart of the enemy's territory, armed with nothing but the truth. As she left the valley, she did not look back. The past was behind her. The future was a terrifying, uncertain storm, but she would walk into it with her head held high, a silent queen, ready to claim her throne. Or die trying. The journey to the capital city of Silverwood was a brutal assault on the senses. After 5 years in the pristine silence of her valley, the world felt loud, chaotic, and stained. The roads were crowded with shifters from every corner of the kingdom, all converging for the grand mating ball. The air, thick with a cacophony of scents, anxiety, ambition, lust, and cheap perfume, was a physical irritant, making her nose twitch and her head ache. She traveled on foot, keeping to the edges of the forest that flanked the main road, a solitary figure in a simple green dress. Other travelers gave her a wide berth. Her scent was too wild, her silence too unnerving. They saw a rogue, a feral creature of the woods, and their pack-bred instincts screamed at them to be wary. She welcomed their distance. It was a cloak of invisibility, allowing her to observe without being observed. She saw alphas in fine carriages, their chests puffed with arrogance, their lunas dripping with jewels. She saw hopeful she-wolves, their faces painted with desperate smiles, their laughter brittle and sharp. It was a parade of power and pretense, and it all felt utterly alien to her. The city itself was a nightmare of stone and noise. Buildings scraped the sky, blocking out the sun. The roar of the crowds was a constant, deafening wave. It took all of her hard-won control not to let her wolf panic, to not bolt back to the safety of the trees. She navigated the crowded streets like a phantom, her movements fluid and silent, her eyes missing nothing. She found the address Silas had given her, a small, unassuming cottage in the quiet Omega sector. The air here was calmer, the scents less aggressive. She knocked, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The door opened, and there he was. Silas was even older than she remembered. His back stooped and his face a roadmap of wrinkles, but his eyes were the same, kind, intelligent, and perceptive. He looked at her. Then his gaze dropped to the two small children hiding behind her legs. A soft, sad smile touched his lips. "Elara," he breathed, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "Goddess be praised, you're alive." He ushered them inside, his movements slow but deliberate. He knelt before Liam and Lyra, his old eyes widening slightly as he saw the boys' silver irises. "And these must be the secret," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "Alpha Kalen is a fool, a blind, arrogant fool." The meeting was brief. There was no time for a lengthy reunion. She explained the final details of her plan, her voice low and steady. Silas listened, nodding, his expression grim but resolute. He swore on his ancestors that he would protect the children with his life. Leaving them with him was the hardest thing she had ever done. Lyra cried, her small hands clinging to Alara's dress. Liam tried to be brave, but his silver eyes were shimmering with unshed tears. She kissed them both, her composure cracking for just a moment. "Be good for Silas," she whispered. "Mama has to go to a party. I will be back before the moon is high." She walked away, without looking back. The sound of her daughter's cries, a knife in her heart. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to snatch them up and run back to their hidden valley. But she forced herself onward, her resolve hardening with every step. The royal palace was an obscene display of wealth and power, a mountain of white marble and glittering gold that seemed to challenge the heavens. Guards in polished silver armor stood at the gates, their faces impassive. She presented her summons, the crimson seal of the king glowing in the torchlight. The guard looked from the parchment to her, his eyes lingering on her simple dress, her unadorned hair, the faint scent of the wild that clung to her. A flicker of disdain crossed his face, but the seal was undeniable. He waved her through with a dismissive gesture. She stepped inside, and the world fell away. The great hall was a cavern of light and sound. Thousands of crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a dazzling starlight glow over the throng of shifters below. Music from a royal orchestra swelled and filled the air, a symphony of soaring strings and triumphant horns. The most powerful wolves in the kingdom were all here, dressed in silks and velvets, adorned with jewels that flashed and glittered with every movement. They were a sea of beautiful, dangerous predators, and she was a drop of alien water in their midst. She found a shadowed alcove near the back of the hall, a place where she could watch without being the center of attention. From her vantage point, she saw them. Kaelin and Lyra stood near the center of the room, holding court. Kaelin was even more imposing than she remembered, his black tunic tailored to perfection, his silver eyes cold and commanding. Lyra was a vision in blood-red silk, her laughter tinkling as she charmed the alphas and their mates who clamored for their attention. They were the perfect couple, the embodiment of power and grace. The sight of them together sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated hatred through her, so potent, it almost made her gasp. It was a cold, clean feeling, a fire that burned away, the last of her fear. She watched them, her face a mask of placid indifference, her mind a whirlwind of cold calculation. They preened and postured, completely unaware that their judge and jury had entered the room. They had built their lives on her supposed grave, and they were celebrating on the tombstone. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her loss. The years of stolen peace, the childhood her own children would never have in a pack, the life she could have led. The grief was a sharp, physical pain, but she did not let it show. She tucked it away, deep inside, and let the cold rage fuel her instead. She was a ghost at their feast, a silent specter of a past they thought was long buried. Soon the haunting would begin. The orchestra would stop. The laughter would die. And in the silence, her voice, so long unheard, would be the only thing that mattered. She saw a few wolves from her old pack, Blackwood Ridge, among the crowd. They glanced her way, a flicker of recognition in their eyes, followed by confusion, and then a sneer of contempt. The hybrid outcast. The witch. The whispers started, a low hiss that spread through the nearby clusters of guests. She felt their eyes on her, their judgment a palpable weight. She did not flinch. She met their stares with her calm, green gaze, her silence an unbreakable shield. Let them whisper. Let them stare. Their scorn was nothing to her now. It was merely the overture to the opera of their destruction. The hours crawled by, each minute a stretched-out eternity of waiting. Elara remained in her alcove, a statue carved from shadow and patience. She watched the endless dance of pack politics, the subtle shifts of power, the false smiles, and predatory glances. It was a world she had never belonged to and never would. Her world was one of real predators, of honest hunger and clean kills, not this theater of veiled threats and poisoned pleasantries. Eventually, as if drawn by the magnetic pull of their own arrogance, Kaelin and Lyra began to move through the crowd, their path inevitably leading them toward her shadowed corner. Lyra saw her first. Her perfectly painted smile faltered for a fraction of a second, her eyes widening in disbelief. She recovered quickly, her expression morphing into one of cruel amusement. She leaned in and whispered something to Kaelin, her red-nailed hand gripping his arm. Kaelin followed her gaze, and his eyes landed on Elara. His face went blank with shock, then darkened into a thunderous scowl. The powerful alpha of Blackwood Ridge, who commanded the respect and fear of all his neighbors, looked genuinely rattled. The sight sent a sliver of grim satisfaction through Elara. He thought she was dead. He had willed her to be dead. Her very existence was an affront to his authority, a loose thread in the perfect tapestry of his life. They approached her, their movements cutting a swath through the surrounding guests, who parted for them like minnows before a shark. The whispers intensified, the crowd sensing a confrontation. Kaelin stopped a few feet from her, his sheer physical presence designed to intimidate. He was taller, broader, a mountain of muscle and power, next to her lean, wild-forged frame. "You!" he growled, his voice a low rumble of contained fury. "What are you doing here? Crawled out of whatever hole you've been hiding in." Elara said nothing. She simply met his furious silver gaze with her own calm, unblinking one. Her silence seemed to infuriate him more than any retort could have. It was a denial of his power, a refusal to engage on his terms. Lyra stepped forward, her red dress a slash of color against the shadows. Her scent was cloying, a mix of expensive perfume and something sharp and bitter, the smell of her own venom. "I must say, Alara, I'm surprised to see you," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We all thought you'd perished in the wilderness years ago. You look surprisingly well. Feral, but well." Her eyes raked over Alara's simple green dress, the lack of jewels, the calluses on her hands. The insult was clear. "You are nothing. You are trash." Still, Alara remained silent. She held their gazes, letting their hatred wash over her. It had no power here. It was the impotent rage of bullies who had just discovered their victim was no longer afraid of them. "The king's decree is for unmated she-wolves," Kalen sneered, recovering his composure, his voice regaining its familiar tone of command. "Not for tainted, barren outcasts. Your presence here is an insult to this gathering and to the king himself. You will leave now." He was trying to provoke her, to bait her into an outburst that would justify him having her forcibly removed. He wanted her to scream, to cry, to make a scene. He wanted the frightened, broken girl he had exiled. He was not prepared for the woman who stood before him. Alara tilted her head slightly, a small, almost imperceptible movement. It was the only acknowledgement she gave him. She did not move to leave. She did not speak. She simply stood her ground, a silent, immovable object against the force of his will. Kalen's face flushed with anger. He was being defied, publicly, by the one person in the world he considered beneath his notice. He took a step closer, his alpha aura flaring, a wave of dominance meant to bring lesser wolves to their knees. "Do you hear me, hybrid?" he snarled, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that was somehow more menacing than his shouts. "Get out before I have you thrown out." A ripple of fear went through the onlookers. They could feel the pressure of his anger, the promise of violence. But Alara felt nothing. She had faced down starving bears in the dead of winter. She had given birth alone in a secluded cottage. His pack leader posturing was nothing more than the blustering of a tyrant. Her complete lack of reaction was a public slap in the face. He was the mighty Alpha Kalen, and this nothing was refusing to cower. His authority was being challenged by her silence. The tension in the air became thick and heavy, a palpable thing. The music seemed to fade into the background. Everyone in that corner of the hall was watching, waiting to see what would happen. Would the Alpha strike her? Would she finally break? It was in that moment, when the confrontation had reached its peak, that a new presence entered the hall. A sudden, profound silence fell over the entire assembly, starting from the grand entrance and spreading like a wave, extinguishing all conversation as it went. The orchestra faltered, then stopped completely. A pressure, ancient and immense, settled over the room. A power so vast it made Kalen's alpha aura feel like a child's tantrum. Every head turned towards the entrance. A figure stood there, flanked by 2 royal guards. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with hair the color of spun silver and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. He was not dressed in the flamboyant silks of the other alphas, but in simple, dark leathers that spoke of practicality and power. His presence alone commanded absolute authority. King Theron, the alpha of all alphas, had arrived. His gaze, heavy with the weight of centuries, began to sweep across the room. Kalen immediately straightened up, his personal conflict forgotten. He composed his features into a look of respect, a loyal subject before his monarch. Lyra curtsied low, a perfect picture of grace. They thought the king's arrival had saved them from their frustrating confrontation. They had no idea it was the beginning of their end. The king's eyes moved over the glittering crowd, past the powerful, the wealthy, the beautiful. His gaze was dismissive, as if he were searching for something specific, something the rest of them could not see. And then his eyes found the shadowed alcove. They passed over Kalen and Lyra without a flicker of recognition. They settled on Alara, and for the first time that night, the king's stern expression softened, touched by something that looked like recognition, like he had found exactly who he was looking for. The world seemed to hold its breath. The king's gaze remained fixed on Alara, a tangible connection that cut through the cavernous hall. For a long, silent moment, he simply looked at her, and in his ancient, knowing eyes, she felt seen for the first time in her life. He saw not a hybrid, not an outcast, not a victim. He saw the truth of her, the strength forged in exile, the quiet dignity of a survivor. Kylan, standing beside her, was utterly baffled. He could not comprehend why the king's attention was fixed on this worthless creature. He shifted his weight, clearing his throat, attempting to draw the monarch's gaze. He was Alpha Kalen, a powerful regional leader. He was the one who deserved the king's notice, not this feral stray. "Your Majesty," Kalen said, his voice imbued with a deep, respectful tone that was entirely false. "It is an honor to have you grace us with your presence. We were just removing a slight disturbance. This she-wolf does not belong here." King Therony's eyes did not leave Alara's. It was as if Kalen had not spoken at all. The public snub was so profound, so absolute, that a low murmur rippled through the nearby crowd. Kalen's face tightened, a hint of his earlier anger returning, now mixed with humiliation. Lyra, ever the opportunist, saw a chance to ingratiate herself while simultaneously twisting the knife in Alara's back. She stepped forward, curtsying again, her voice a pitch of perfect, feigned concern. "Forgive us, Your Majesty. This poor thing is confused. She is an outcast from our pack, a barren half-breed with a troubled mind. We believe her presence here is a violation of your noble decree. She is not a viable candidate for any mate, let alone for this prestigious gathering." The lies were so practiced, so smooth. She delivered them with a look of pity directed at Alara, the consummate actress playing her part. She assumed the king, like all other alphas, would value purity and strength above all else. She assumed he would see Alara, as they did, a genetic dead end, a stain to be scrubbed away. They could not have been more wrong. The king finally broke his silent communion with Alara. He turned his head, slowly, his ancient eyes pinning Lyra in place. The pressure of his gaze was immense, and for the first time, Lyra's perfect composure faltered. A flicker of fear crossed her face. "You are the Luna of the Blackwood Pack?" the king asked. His voice was not loud, but it carried an inherent authority that resonated in the bones of every shifter in the hall. "Yes, Your Majesty," Lyra managed, her voice a little breathless. "It is my honor." "And you," the king said, his gaze shifting to Kalen, "are its alpha." "I am, Your Majesty," Kalen said, puffing out his chest slightly, his pride momentarily restored by the king's acknowledgement. The king looked from Kalen's arrogant face to Lyra's beautiful, venomous one. Then he looked back at Alara, who stood serene and silent amidst the turmoil. A long moment passed. Then the king began to walk. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his every step echoing in the profound silence. The sea of shifters parted before him, their heads bowed in deference. He did not walk towards the throne set up on the dais. He did not walk towards the other powerful alphas who waited to greet him. He walked in a straight, unwavering line towards the shadowed alcove. He walked directly towards Alara. Kalen's mind reeled. This was impossible. This could not be happening. The king was ignoring him, the powerful, respected alpha and his beautiful Luna, to approach the pack's filth. It was a dream, a nightmare. He wanted to shout, to demand an explanation, but his throat was tight with a mixture of awe and terror. The king stopped directly in front of Alara. He was even taller up close, a true monarch of their kind, radiating a power that felt as old as the mountains. He looked down at her, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "They say the rarest flowers grow in the harshest climates," he said, his voice a low, intimate rumble meant only for her, though in the dead silence, everyone heard it. "They say the strongest souls are forged in the cruelest fires." He reached out, his hand moving slowly, giving her time to react. He gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, his touch surprisingly gentle. Alara did not flinch. She simply looked up at him, her green eyes holding his. In that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. He knew, somehow, he knew everything. The collective gasp of the entire assembly was a sharp, rushing wind. They were witnessing the unthinkable. The Alpha King, the most powerful, most sought-after male on the continent, was touching the outcast, the hybrid, with a tenderness he had never shown to any other. Kalen stared, his mouth agape, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. This was a joke. A test, it had to be. The king was testing his loyalty, his judgment. Yes, that was it. He would expose the hybrid for the fraud she was, and the king would reward him for his insight. Bolstered by his own deluded logic, Kalen took a step forward. "Your Majesty, I must insist," he said, his voice strained. "You do not understand what this creature is. She is magnificent," the king interrupted, his voice cutting through Kalen's like a blade of ice. He did not even turn to look at him. His full attention remained on Alara. He then raised his voice, and it boomed through the hall, a formal declaration that shattered every expectation. "I have made my choice." He looked down at Alara, his ancient eyes soft. "I, King Theron, Alpha of all Alphas, choose this she-wolf. I choose Alara." The world tilted on its axis. The silence that followed was not one of respect, but of pure, unadulterated shock. It was a silence so complete, so absolute, that the sound of a single wine glass slipping from a nerveless hand and shattering on the marble floor was like a thunderclap. Kalen laughed, a short, harsh, disbelieving bark of a sound. He could not help it. The absurdity of the situation was too much. "A joke," he said, shaking his head. "A fine joke, Your Majesty. You have a keen sense of humor, choosing the one creature in this room utterly unworthy of anyone, let alone a king." The king finally turned to face him. The softness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold fire that promised utter annihilation. "It was not a joke, Alpha Kalen," he said, his voice lethally calm. "It was a decree." The king's words hung in the air, each one a hammer blow against the foundation of Kalen's world. A decree, not a choice, not a whim, but an order from the highest authority, absolute and irrevocable. Kalen's laughter died in his throat, replaced by a choking sensation of disbelief and rising panic. His mind, so accustomed to being the ultimate authority in his own sphere, could not process this catastrophic inversion of logic. The king could not be serious. To choose this, then this nothing, over the hundreds of pristine, high-born she-wolves in attendance. It was madness. "But, Your Majesty, with all due respect, you cannot," Kalen stammered, his carefully constructed composure crumbling. He gestured wildly at Alara, his hand trembling with rage. "Look at her. She is a half-breed, a taint on our kind. She is barren. I myself declared it so 5 years ago. She has no pack, no status, no worth. She cannot be queen." His public challenge to the king's decree was a shocking breach of protocol. A wave of horrified murmurs swept through the crowd. To question an alpha was dangerous. To question the Alpha King was suicide. Lyra, seeing the disastrous turn of events, rushed to Kalen's side, placing a restraining hand on his arm. "Kalen, my love, be silent," she hissed, her eyes wide with fear. But Kalen was beyond reason. His pride, His entire identity as an alpha who made unerring judgments was on the line, and he had built his reputation on the pillars of purity and strength. And Ilara's very existence was an indictment of those principles. If the king chose her, it meant the king saw value where Kaelin had seen only filth. It meant Kaelin was wrong, and Kaelin was never wrong. "I will not be silent," he roared, shaking off Lyra's hand. He pointed an accusing finger at Ilara. "This witch has fooled you with some sort of dark magic. She is empty, cursed. I exiled her to protect my pack from her barren, impure nature. I forbid this union." The sheer audacity of his proclamation, his use of the word forbid to his king, sent a collective shockwave through the hall. The royal guards at the king's side tensed, their hands moving to the hilts of their swords. King Theron, however, remained perfectly calm. He looked at Kaelin's apoplectic face with an expression of profound pity, as one might look at a rabid dog about to be put down. "Your words are noted, Alpha Kaelin," the king said, his voice dangerously soft. "You have made several claims that she is tainted, that she is worthless, and I can tease that she is barren." He turned his gaze back to Ilara, who had watched Kaelin's tirade with the detached calm of a spectator at a particularly vulgar play. "What say you, Ilara? Are you the things he claims?" This was the moment, the culmination of 5 years of pain, of survival, of silent endurance. The stage was set, the audience was rapt, and her accuser had just handed her the sword with which to cut out his own heart. Ilara took a small step forward, away from the shadows of the alcove and into the full, brilliant light of the chandeliers. She looked not at the king, but directly at Kaelin, her green eyes clear and sharp. And, for the first time in 5 years, she spoke to him. Her voice was not the timid whisper he remembered. It was low, clear and steady, imbued with the quiet authority of the wild. It carried across the silent hall, each word perfectly enunciated. "You claim my blood is tainted, Kaelin," as she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "My mother was a healer. She saved more lives with her knowledge than your warriors have ever taken. You call that a taint. I call it a gift." She then looked at Lyra, whose face had gone pale. "You claim I am worthless. You built your position as Luna on my supposed worthlessness. You whispered your poison into his ear, and he, in his arrogance, was all too eager to drink it." Finally, her gaze returned to Kaelin, and her eyes were as cold and unforgiving as a winter river. "And you claim I am barren." A small ghost of a smile touched her lips. It was a terrifying sight. "That is the most foolish lie of all. Because on that, Alpha Kaelin, I have proof to the contrary." Kaelin stared at her, his mind struggling to grasp her meaning. Proof? What proof could she possibly have? He had cast her out himself. She had been alone. "Proof?" he scoffed, his voice regaining a fraction of its bluster. "What proof? You have nothing. You are nothing." "Oh, but I do have something," Ilara replied, her voice dropping slightly, drawing the entire audience in. "Or, rather, I have two somethings, two very important reasons why your claim is a lie." The king watched the exchange, his expression unreadable, but a glint of anticipation in his ancient eyes. He knew what was coming. He had orchestrated this. "I was not barren 5 years ago, Kaelin," Ilara continued, her voice rising with controlled power. "And I was not alone when you cast me out. I was carrying your children." The confession detonated in the hall with the force of a physical explosion. 1,000 gasps sounded as one. Lyra stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Kaelin froze, his face a mask of utter, uncomprehending shock. His mind flashed back a frantic, desperate search through his memories. The full moon, a fleeting, primal encounter in the Aiti woods. A girl whose face he barely recalled. A hybrid girl. Ilara. "No," he whispered, the word a strangled denial. "No, it's a lie. A desperate, pathetic lie from a desperate, pathetic creature." "Is it?" Alara's voice was merciless. Would you like to see them? Would you like to meet the heirs you threw away? She turned her head and gave a single sharp nod towards the grand entrance. It was the signal. A moment later, the great doors opened again. An old Omega wolf, Silas, stepped into the hall. He was not alone. By each hand, he held a small child, a boy with dark hair and a serious expression, and a girl with lighter hair and a curious gaze. They were dressed in simple, clean clothes, their eyes wide as they took in the glittering spectacle before them. Silas led them forward into the center of the hall, and then he stepped back, leaving the two children standing alone in the vast, silent space. Every eye was on them, on the little girl with the mossy green eyes, and on the little boy who looked up, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces, his eyes shining in the brilliant light. They were the purest, most luminous silver, the unmistakable, undeniable silver of the Blackwood Alpha line. The sight of the children, so small and so brave, in the center of that vast, silent hall, was a truth more powerful than any oath, more damning than any testimony. The boy, Liam, stood with a stoic gravity that was a miniature echo of the man who was now staring at him, his world collapsing inward. The girl, Lyra, clutched her brother's hand, her green eyes, so like her mother's, wide with a mixture of fear and wonder, but it was the boy's eyes that held the entire assembly in a state of suspended animation. Silver, the legendary silver eyes of the Blackwood Alphas, a genetic marker so dominant and so rare that it was spoken of in whispers of reverence, and they were staring out of the face of a 5-year-old child who should not exist. The internal world of Alpha Kalen fractured. The confident, arrogant ruler ceased to exist, replaced by a man drowning in a tidal wave of catastrophic revelation. His thoughts, once so clear and commanding, became a chaotic storm of denial, horror, and a dawning, soul-crushing understanding. His silver eyes. No, it's a trick of the light, a glamour, a witch's spell. It cannot be. I cast her out. She was barren. I decreed it. My word is law. My word is truth. But his senses, the primal instincts of a wolf, betrayed his frantic denial. A new scent was on the air, faint beneath the cloying perfumes of the court, but piercingly clear to him. It was the scent of his own blood, his own lineage, radiating from the two small figures in the center of the room. It was a scent he had never known, but recognized on a cellular level. It was the scent of his son, his heir, the son he had unknowingly condemned to exile, the son whose mother he had publicly shamed and left for dead. The silence in the hall stretched, thin and taut, until it finally snapped. It was Lyra who broke it. A choked, horrified sob escaped her lips. Her perfect mask of composure shattered into a million pieces. This was a nightmare from which she could not wake. For 5 years, she'd been Luna. She had enjoyed the power, the prestige, the adoration of the pack, but she had failed in her one primary duty. She had not produced an heir. She and Kalen had tried, month after month, year after year, consulting healers, praying to the goddess, but she had remained barren, a cruel, bitter irony that she had hidden behind a facade of contentment. And now, here was the living proof of her failure and Alara's triumph. Here was the heir she could never provide, born to the woman she had destroyed. Kalen, she whimpered, tugging on his sleeve, her face ashen. Do something. Tell them it's a lie. But Kalen was paralyzed, his silver eyes locked with his son's. He saw his own father in the boy's features, his grandfather in the set of his jaw. He saw generations of Blackwood Alphas staring back at him from the face of the child of the woman he had called worthless. Alara's voice cut through his internal chaos, calm and precise. His name is Liam, she said, her gaze soft as she looked at her son. And she is Lyra. I named her so that I would never forget the name of the woman whose jealousy cost me my home. The directed, personal cruelty of that statement was a masterstroke. She had not only reclaimed the name, but she had turned it into a living monument to her rival's treachery. The crowd erupted in a roar of whispers. The pieces of the puzzle were clicking into place for everyone. The barren Luna, the exiled hybrid, the sudden appearance of a silver-eyed heir. The story was as old as time. A tale of jealousy, lies, and a terrible, terrible mistake. The king stepped forward, his presence reasserting control over the chaotic scene. He walked to the children and knelt before them, an act of humility that stunned the assembled alphas. He smiled gently at Liam and Lyra. "Do not be afraid, little ones," he said, his voice soft. He looked at Liam. "What a fine, strong boy you are. You have the eyes of a king." Then he turned his gaze, cold and hard as diamond, upon Kaelin. "Alpha Kaelin," he said, his voice now resonating with royal authority. "You stand accused. You rejected and exiled a she-wolf of your pack based on lies. You condemned your own unborn children to the wilderness. You have proven yourself blind, foolish, and unfit to lead." Kaelin finally broke. A strangled sound, half sob, half scream, tore from his throat. No, she tricked me. Lyra told me." He turned on his Luna, his eyes wild with betrayal. You did this. You told me she was a barren witch. You lied to me." Lyra recoiled as if struck. "I only said what others were whispering," she cried, her voice shrill with panic. "I was trying to protect." "You, to protect the pack from her tainted blood." "Liar!" Kaelin bellowed, his control completely gone. He was no longer an alpha. He was a cornered animal, lashing out at his tormentors. "You wanted me for yourself. You saw she had my favor, and you poisoned me against her." In his desperation, he had admitted it. He had admitted that Alara once held his favor, confessing the truth of their secret encounter to the entire assembly. He had just sealed his own fate and exposed the root of Lyra's motive. The public humiliation was absolute. The king rose to his full height, his face a mask of cold judgment. "Enough," he commanded. The single word silenced the entire hall. "Your squabbling is pathetic. Your guilt is plain, for all to see." He raised his hand, pointing a finger first at Lyra. "For your treachery, your lies, and your role in the exile of an innocent she-wolf and her children, you are stripped of your title as Luna. You will be returned to the Blackwood Pack, not as a leader, but as the lowest Omega. You will spend the rest of your days serving the pack you sought to rule, a constant reminder of the consequences of deceit." Lyra collapsed to the floor, her sobs of despair lost in the shocked silence. Then the king's finger moved to Kaelin. "And you, Alpha Kaelin, for your gross failure of judgment, for your cruelty, for abandoning your own blood, and for the ultimate crime of weakness in leadership, I hereby strip you of your title and your pack. The Blackwood Ridge is no longer yours to command. You are an alpha, no more. You are packless, an outcast, exiled, just as you exiled her." The king's judgment was final. It was a death sentence in all but name. To be a packless alpha was to be a target for every rival, every rogue, every challenger. Kaelin sank to his knees, the last of his strength leaving him. His reign, his power, his entire life was over, ruined in a single night by a truth he had refused to see. Alara watched his utter destruction, her face impassive. She felt no triumph, no joy, only a quiet, hollow sense of finality. The scales were balanced. Justice had been served. She walked to her children, her heart aching with love and relief. She knelt and gathered them into her arms, burying her face in their hair. They were safe. Their future was secure. The king came to stand beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "A new alpha will be appointed to the Blackwood Pack," he said softly. "One who will honor your children and their birthright." He looked down at her, his ancient eyes holding a deep, and profound respect. You have endured the unendurable, Alara. You have shown a strength that few possess. Your children will grow up knowing their mother is a queen. She looked up at him, tears finally welling in her eyes. They were not tears of sadness, but of release. The weight of 5 years of struggle was finally lifting. She was free. She took her children's hands. And, together, the four of them, the king, the wronged she-wolf, and the two lost heirs, turned their backs on the wreckage of Kalen's life and walked away towards a new dawn.